This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. Today's story isn't about fighting, it's about ego, discipline, and what true martial arts really teaches. When a karate black belt publicly challenged Steven Seagal, everyone expected a fight. But what happened next shocked people, not because of violence, but because of calm control and restraint. The seminar hall wasn't loud or flashy. It was the kind of place where discipline spoke quietly. Wooden floors polished from years of training, walls lined with faded photos of past tournaments, and rows of students sitting respectfully on the mats. Among the audience, almost no one noticed the man seated near the back. Steven Seagal wasn't introduced. There was no announcement. No spotlight. He wore simple clothes, sat relaxed, and listened like any other attendee. To most people in the room, he looked like just another guest who appreciated martial arts. But not everyone missed him. Across the room stood a local karate instructor, a respected black belt with years of competition experience. His students admired him. His reputation in the local martial arts community mattered deeply to him. As he spoke about discipline and technique, his eyes occasionally drifted toward the back of the room. Toward Steven. Something about the way Steven sat, calm, observant, completely at ease, unsettled him. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't disrespect. It was confidence without display. After the session ended, students gathered around the instructor, praising the demonstration. Conversations filled the hall. That's when the instructor finally walked toward Steven. At first, the approach was polite. "You train?" he asked. Steven smiled slightly. "Yes," he replied. "I've spent some time learning." The instructor nodded, then asked another question. "What style?" Steven answered honestly but briefly. That was when the tone shifted. The instructor folded his arms. "Interesting," he said. "Because I've seen a lot of styles. And not all of them hold up under pressure." Steven didn't react defensively. He listened. A few students nearby noticed the tension and leaned in slightly, curious. This wasn't open hostility, but it wasn't friendly curiosity either. "You know," the instructor continued, voice calm but edged with pride, "people talk a lot about reputation. But reputation doesn't mean much unless it's tested." Steven met his eyes. "Testing isn't always necessary," he said. "Understanding matters more." That answer drew quiet murmurs. The instructor smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was challenge. "Well," he said, loud enough for others to hear now, "in karate, understanding comes from pressure." The room slowly went quiet. Steven remained calm. No raised voice. No posture change. Just a steady presence. And in that moment, everyone could feel it. Something was building. Not a fight. Not an argument. A moment of choice. Because what happened next wouldn't be about strength. It would be about ego. And whether discipline truly meant what people claimed it did. The silence in the hall didn't feel uncomfortable at first. It felt curious. Students pretended to roll up their mats, but their attention stayed fixed on the two men facing each other. The instructor's words had lingered in the air. Understanding comes from pressure. It wasn't an insult, but it wasn't harmless either. Steven Seagal noticed the shift immediately. He had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where pride quietly sharpened itself into something dangerous, not because anyone wanted violence, but because someone wanted validation. The instructor took a step closer. "So," he said casually, "you've trained, but not in karate?" Steven nodded. "That's right." The instructor smiled, glancing briefly at the students around them. "Interesting. Because karate teaches structure, control, real discipline." Steven's voice remained calm. "Those values aren't limited to one style." That response drew a few raised eyebrows. The instructor crossed his arms again. "Maybe. But in my experience, people say that when they don't want to be tested." Steven didn't interrupt. He let the words land. A student shifted uncomfortably. Another whispered, "Is he challenging him?" The instructor continued, louder now, not aggressive, but clearly intentional. "Martial arts isn't theory. It's pressure. If you don't apply it, you don't really know it." Steven exhaled slowly. Pressure reveals more about intent than skill, he said. And intent matters. That answer made a few students nod. Others looked confused. The instructor's smile tightened. You sound confident, he said. But confidence without proof doesn't carry much weight around here. The implication was clear now. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a challenge, carefully framed, socially acceptable, but designed to corner. Stephen looked around the hall. At the students. At the environment meant for learning, not proving. I'm not here to compete, he said. I came to observe. The instructor raised an eyebrow. Observation is safe, he replied. But safety doesn't teach much. A few quiet laughs followed. Not mocking, nervous. Stephen felt the pressure building, not from the instructor alone, but from expectation. People wanted an outcome. They wanted to see something happen. He chose his words carefully. Martial arts isn't about showing, he said. It's about understanding when not to. The instructor shook his head slightly. That sounds like avoidance. Stephen met his gaze. No, he said. It's restraint. That word changed the atmosphere. Restraint. The instructor glanced again at the students, sensing the room was no longer fully on his side. He adjusted his approach. Look, he said, lowering his voice just enough to seem reasonable. I'm not looking for trouble. But if someone claims experience, it's fair to ask them to demonstrate. Stephen tilted his head slightly. Demonstration can be many things, he replied. It doesn't have to be a fight. The instructor paused. That wasn't the answer he expected. Most people either accepted the challenge or backed away. Stephen had done neither. What are you saying? The instructor asked. I'm saying, Stephen replied calmly, that skill doesn't need an audience. And ego doesn't need encouragement. The room went quiet again. A student at the back whispered, That hit hard. The instructor felt it, the moment slipping. The challenge had been issued, but the outcome was no longer under his control. He took a breath. Fine, he said. No fight. Stephen nodded slightly. But, the instructor continued, if you really believe what you're saying, then show us what restraint looks like. Eyes turned back to Stephen. This time, the challenge wasn't about dominance. It was about definition. Stephen didn't respond immediately. He looked at the floor, at the mats, at the students who had come to learn. Then he looked back up. All right, he said quietly. But we do this the right way. The instructor frowned slightly. The right way. Stephen nodded. No strikes. No competition. Just understanding. The room buzzed with anticipation. Nobody knew what that meant yet. But everyone could feel it. Whatever was about to happen next would surprise them. Not because of force, but because of what it would reveal. The room didn't erupt. There were no cheers. No sudden movement. Instead, a quiet anticipation settled over the seminar hall, the kind that makes people sit straighter without realizing it. Seagal stepped onto the edge of the mat, not as someone preparing for a fight, but as someone preparing for a conversation without words. Before we do anything, he said calmly, I want to be clear. The instructor nodded, arms still folded, confident but alert. This isn't about proving who's better, Stephen continued. If that's the goal, we stop now. A few students exchanged glances. The instructor hesitated for a moment, then replied, I'm listening. Stephen gestured toward the center of the mat. No strikes, he said. No throws meant to dominate. Just positioning. Balance. Control. The instructor frowned slightly. That's not how challenges usually work. That's exactly why this isn't one, Stephen replied. The room grew quieter. This was unfamiliar territory. People had expected tension to explode into action, not dissolve into explanation. Stephen stepped forward and removed his shoes, placing them neatly beside the mat. The small gesture spoke volumes. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was respectful. The instructor followed suit, though his movements were sharper, more deliberate. He rolled his shoulders once, preparing himself. A student whispered, Is this really happening? Stephen faced the instructor and raised his hand slowly, not into a fighting stance, but into a neutral position. "Come close," Stephen said. "Not to attack. Just to stand." The instructor hesitated, then stepped forward until they were within arm's length. "Notice your weight," Stephen said quietly. "Where is it?" The instructor blinked, slightly confused. "Centered," he replied. Stephen nodded. "You think it is?" He shifted his own feet just a few inches, subtle enough that most of the audience barely noticed. "Now push," Stephen said. "Not hard. Just enough." The instructor placed his hands against Stephen's shoulders and applied pressure. Nothing happened. Stephen didn't move, didn't tense, didn't resist visibly. The instructor increased pressure slightly. Still nothing. Murmurs rippled through the room. "How is he not moving? He's not even bracing." Stephen stepped sideways, slow, deliberate, and the instructor suddenly stumbled forward, forced to catch himself. The room inhaled collectively. Stephen stepped back immediately, palms open. "That wasn't strength," he said. "That was timing." The instructor straightened, clearly unsettled now. His confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had been questioned. "Again," he said. Stephen nodded. This time, Stephen invited him to grip his wrist. "Hold tight," Stephen instructed. The instructor complied. Stephen rotated his arm slightly, not fast, not forceful, and the instructor felt pressure travel through his grip, into his elbow, into his balance. His hand loosened instinctively. He stepped back, surprised. Stephen released immediately. No pain. No embarrassment. Just realization. The room buzzed now. That was clean. He didn't even try to hurt him. That wasn't karate, but it worked. The instructor took a slow breath. "What style is that?" he asked. Stephen smiled faintly. "It's not about style," he said. "It's about awareness." The instructor frowned, processing. "So you're saying technique beats power?" Stephen shook his head. "I'm saying intention beats ego." That landed harder than any demonstration. The instructor looked around, at his students, at the faces watching closely, at the mat beneath his feet. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He was learning. "Again," he said, but this time his tone had changed. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. Stephen nodded and stepped forward. They moved together slowly now. The instructor tried to apply pressure. Stephen redirected. Tried to control the arm. Stephen adjusted position. Each movement was calm, efficient, and deliberate. No one was winning, but everyone was understanding. After a few moments, Stephen stepped back. "That's enough," he said gently. The instructor lowered his hands. Silence followed. Then someone at the back spoke quietly. "I've trained for years, and I've never seen it explained like that." Stephen looked toward the students. "That's because most people rush to prove," he said. "Very few stop to understand." The instructor stood still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he bowed. Not out of defeat. Out of respect. The room reacted instantly, not with applause, but with something deeper. Recognition. The challenge everyone expected had ended without a fight. Without humiliation. Without force. And yet, everyone knew something significant had just happened. Because the shock wasn't in what Stephen did. It was in what he didn't need to do. And the instructor, once confident, now thoughtful, realized something that would stay with him long after the seminar ended. True mastery doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself. Quietly. The bow changed everything. Not loudly. Not instantly. But completely. For a few seconds after it happened, no one spoke. The seminar hall, once filled with subtle tension and expectation, now felt still, almost reflective. The kind of silence that follows understanding, not shock. The instructor straightened slowly. His expression was different now. The edge in his eyes was gone. In its place was curiosity, mixed with something rarer. Humility. Steven Seagal returned the bow without hesitation, mirroring it with the same calm respect he had shown from the beginning. There was no winner standing on the mat. Only 2 practitioners, sharing space. The instructor cleared his throat. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, loud enough for the room to hear. Stephen nodded. "Most people don't," he replied, "because they expect resistance." A few students shifted closer now, no longer worried about confrontation. They leaned in the way people do when they sense a lesson unfolding. The instructor gestured toward the mat. "Can you explain," he asked, choosing his words carefully, "why that worked?" Stephen looked around the room before answering. "Because you weren't attacking," he said. "You were trying to control. And control always starts with balance, not force." One of the students raised a hand instinctively. "But Sensei," he said, turning to the instructor, "he didn't even push back." Stephen smiled slightly. "That's the point." He stepped onto the mat again, motioning for the instructor to join him, not as a challenger this time, but as a partner. "When 2 people push against each other," Stephen explained, "they create opposition. Ego feeds on that." He demonstrated slowly, placing his hand lightly on the instructor's shoulder. But when one person redirects instead of resists, ego has nothing to hold on to. The instructor followed the movement carefully this time, not rushing, not testing. Just observing. "Try it," Stephen said. They moved again, slower than before. Stephen adjusted angles, shifted weight, showed how minimal motion could create maximum imbalance without pain or aggression. Murmurs filled the room. "That's not about strength. It's about timing. He's barely moving." Stephen stepped back. "Martial arts gets misunderstood," he said, addressing the room now. "People think it's about proving toughness. But real training is about removing unnecessary conflict." The instructor nodded quietly. "I've been teaching for years," he said, "and I realize now. I've been rewarding intensity more than awareness." That admission carried weight. Students looked at him with renewed respect, not less. Stephen didn't interrupt. He allowed the moment to breathe. "Intensity has its place," Stephen said finally, "but awareness decides how much is needed." The instructor took a slow breath. "So what happens," he asked, "when ego walks into a room like this?" Stephen answered without hesitation. "Ego either learns, or it leaves." A few students smiled. The instructor laughed softly, not defensively this time, but thoughtfully. "I see that now." He turned to his students. "This," he said, gesturing to Stephen, "is something you don't get from belts or trophies." Stephen shook his head gently. "You don't get it from names either," he added. That sentence lingered. A student at the front spoke up. "So, was this ever about a challenge?" The instructor glanced at Stephen, then answered honestly. "At first, yes." He paused. "But now?" He shook his head. "No. Now it's about growth." The room felt lighter. Questions replaced tension. Students asked about balance, about mindset, about when to engage and when to step back. Stephen answered patiently, never dominating the conversation, always redirecting attention back to principles rather than himself. "This isn't something you perform," he said. "It's something you practice quietly." As the seminar drew toward its end, the instructor stood beside Stephen. "I'm glad I asked," he said quietly. Stephen smiled. "So am I." They shook hands, not for the audience, not for validation, but because respect had been earned on both sides. As people began to gather their belongings, the energy in the room was noticeably different from when the session had started. There was no disappointment, no unmet expectations, only reflection. Students left discussing awareness instead of dominance, control instead of victory, and the instructor, once eager to test, now stood thoughtful, already planning how to teach differently. Stephen slipped his shoes back on and moved toward the exit without drawing attention. No applause followed him. No one stopped him for photos. And that, perhaps, was the most fitting ending to the moment. Because the real impact of what had happened wasn't meant to be loud. It was meant to last. The seminar hall slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Mats were rolled up. Conversations softened. People gathered their bags, still talking quietly among themselves, not about who was stronger, but about what they had just understood. The instructor stood near the center of the room, watching his students leave in small groups. He noticed something immediately. They weren't energized in the usual way. They were thoughtful. Seagal had already stepped off the mat and was moving toward the back of the hall. He hadn't announced anything. He hadn't claimed the moment. He had simply finished what he came to do. The instructor caught up to him near the exit. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Stephen stopped and turned, giving him his full attention. "Of course." The instructor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "When you walked in today, did you expect this to happen?" Stephen considered the question. "No," he replied. "But I expected a choice." "A choice?" the instructor asked. "Yes," Stephen said. "Every room gives you one. You either protect your image, or you protect your growth." That answer stayed with the instructor longer than he expected. They stood there for a moment, listening to the fading sounds of the hall. "I've spent years telling my students to control their bodies," the instructor said quietly. "I don't think I've spent enough time teaching them to control their reactions." Stephen nodded. "That's common," he said. "Reaction feels powerful. Control feels invisible." The instructor looked back toward the mat, the same space where minutes earlier he had felt challenged, exposed, and ultimately changed. "I realized something today," he said. "I wasn't testing you. I was testing myself." Stephen smiled faintly. "That's usually how it goes." Across the room, a group of students paused near the door, glancing back. One of them whispered, "That was different," and another replied, "Yeah, I'm still thinking about it." Stephen noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. "This part matters," he said to the instructor. "What you do after the moment." The instructor nodded slowly. "I know." They shook hands again, not out of formality, but understanding. Stephen stepped outside into the quiet air. He didn't look back. Inside the hall, the instructor gathered his remaining students for a few final words. "Today," he said, "we didn't see a fight. And that's important." The students listened closely. "We saw how ego creates pressure," he continued, "and how awareness dissolves it." One student raised a hand. "Sensei, does that mean challenges are wrong?" The instructor shook his head. "No. It means the purpose of a challenge matters." He paused, then added, "If you challenge to prove something, you learn very little. If you challenge to understand, you learn everything." That sentence landed. Over the next few days, the moment didn't fade, it spread quietly. Students talked about it in other gyms. Instructors referenced it in conversations. Not with drama, but with curiosity. "There was this guy at a seminar. He didn't fight. But everyone learned." The instructor found himself adjusting his classes. Less emphasis on winning drills. More on balance. Awareness. Decision-making. He noticed changes almost immediately. Students moved differently. Slower. More intentional. They asked better questions. Weeks later, the instructor received a short message. No signature, no explanation. "Growth begins when you stop defending your identity." He knew exactly who it was from. He printed it and pinned it near the mat. Not as a reminder of Stephen, but as a reminder of the moment. The moment when he realized that being a black belt wasn't about authority. It was about responsibility. And somewhere far from that hall, Stephen continued on, not carrying the story with him, not sharing it, not repeating it. Because for him, it wasn't an achievement. It was simply what discipline looks like when ego steps aside. And for everyone who had witnessed it, that quiet lesson would stay far longer than any demonstration ever could. This is where most stories would end. A challenge. A surprising outcome. A quiet exit. But this is where the real story actually begins. Because what happened in that seminar hall wasn't impressive due to technique. It was powerful because of what it revealed about ego, discipline, and choice. Let's pause the story for a moment. What shocked everyone wasn't that a karate black belt was outmatched. It wasn't that Seagal stayed calm. And it definitely wasn't that there was no fight. What shocked people was this. The challenge was neutralized without humiliation. That's rare. In most public challenges, Someone needs to lose for someone else to win. Pride demands it. Ego feeds on it. But here, no one was crushed, and yet, everything changed. So why did this moment feel so different? Ego versus discipline. Ego wants visibility. It wants an audience. It wants confirmation. Discipline doesn't. Discipline operates quietly. It doesn't rush. It doesn't react instantly. It doesn't need approval. The karate instructor didn't start as a villain. That's important. He was skilled, respected, experienced. But somewhere along the way, confidence had slowly turned into identity. And when identity feels threatened, ego steps in. That's when challenges appear. Not because learning is needed, but because validation is. Stephen didn't shut the challenge down aggressively. He didn't accept it on ego's terms either. Instead, he reframed it. That's the first lesson. You don't have to accept every challenge in the form it's given. Most people think strength is about meeting force with force. But real strength is choosing how to engage. Why no fight was the strongest outcome? Let's be honest. If there had been a fight, people would have talked about techniques, speed, dominance. And a week later, they would have forgotten it. Instead, they talked about restraint. They talked about how pressure disappeared the moment ego stopped pushing. That's because violence ends moments. But understanding reshapes behavior. Stephen didn't remove the instructor's status. He didn't embarrass him in front of students. He didn't win publicly. And because of that, the instructor was able to learn, not defend. That's the second lesson. People only change when their dignity remains intact. Humiliation creates resistance. Respect creates reflection. The difference between skill and mastery. Skill is visible. You can measure it, rank it, award it. Mastery is quieter. Mastery shows up in decision-making, in timing, in knowing when not to act. Anyone can demonstrate power. Very few can demonstrate restraint while being challenged. That's why the room shifted. Students didn't just see something new, they felt something new. They realized that belts don't represent dominance. They represent responsibility. That's the third lesson. The higher your skill, the lower your need to prove it. Why this matters beyond martial arts. This wasn't just a martial arts moment. This was a human moment. We see the same dynamic everywhere. At work, when someone challenges authority. Online, when someone demands a reaction. In relationships, when pride escalates conflict. Most damage doesn't come from bad intentions. It comes from unchecked ego. Stephen didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he didn't let ego set the rules. That's the fourth lesson. Control the frame, and you control the outcome. What the audience misses at first. At first glance, people think, nothing really happened. But that's because we're trained to equate action with impact. In reality, the biggest shift happened internally, in the instructor, in the students, and in everyone watching. The challenge didn't end with applause. It ended with reflection. And reflection lasts longer than excitement. That's the final lesson. The moments that change us most are rarely loud. They're quiet. They're uncomfortable. And they force us to reconsider who we think we are. So when people say they were shocked by what happened next, they're right. They just weren't shocked by what happened. They were shocked by what didn't need to happen. There was no dramatic ending. No applause followed him out the door. No crowd gathered for photos. No moment designed for attention. Steven Seagal simply left the seminar hall the same way he had entered it, quietly, without claiming the moment as his own. And yet, what happened after he left mattered more than anything that had happened on the mat. Inside the hall, the instructor remained standing for a long moment, watching the door close behind him. He didn't feel defeated. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't replaying techniques in his mind. He was replaying decisions, tone, intention, the way a situation could shift without force ever being applied. The students sensed it too. Normally, after a seminar, conversations revolved around drills, sparring, or rankings. This time was different. "I thought strength was about pressure," one student said quietly. "Yeah," another replied, "but he removed the pressure instead." Those words lingered. Over the following weeks, the impact deepened. Classes changed. The instructor slowed things down. He asked different questions. Instead of pushing students to dominate, he challenged them to observe their balance, their reactions, their need to prove something. Mistakes weren't punished. They were examined. Students noticed they were improving in unexpected ways. Less tension. More control. Fewer injuries. Better decisions. And something else happened too. Ego softened. Not vanished, but managed. The instructor kept thinking about one thing Stephen had said. "You don't protect growth by defending your image." That line followed him into every class. It followed students into their daily lives as well. One student mentioned using the lesson during a heated argument at work, choosing not to react. Another spoke about walking away from an online confrontation that would have gone nowhere. The story spread quietly. Not as a viral clip. Not as a headline. But as a principle. People who heard about it didn't say, "Did you see what he did?" They said, "Did you hear what he didn't do?" And that was the shock. Not violence avoided, but ego disarmed. Somewhere else, far from that seminar hall, Stephen continued his life without referencing the moment at all. He didn't post about it. He didn't explain it publicly. Because for him, it wasn't an achievement. It was alignment. Alignment between discipline and behavior. Between skill and responsibility. That's what real mastery looks like when no one is asking for proof. And that's why the moment stayed with people. Because it didn't end when the doors closed. It continued quietly, in choices, in restraint, in moments where reaction would have been easier. So when people say, "A karate black belt challenged him, and what happened next shocked everyone," they're not talking about a technique. They're talking about a realization. That real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to win. It simply is. If this story resonated with you, remember this. The strongest people aren't the ones who dominate moments. They're the ones who decide how moments unfold. And the greatest victories often happen quietly, when ego steps aside and discipline takes its place. If you believe discipline is stronger than ego, type respect in the comments and subscribe for more fictional stories with real-life lessons.